People think power is loud, slamming fists, shouting matches, or shredded contracts. But at the apex of corporate America, true power is dead silent. When the arrogant crown prince of Sterling Omnicorp brushed my hand away and smirked, he thought he was swatting away a nobody. He never realized that single gesture triggered an irreversible code. By sunrise the next morning, $2.9 billion had vanished from their system without a single trace. Hello, beloved listeners of Boss Revenge Stories. Thank you so much for your continued support. Fortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us without the budget to continue operations, meaning we will be forced to stop uploading new videos here very soon and shift our efforts entirely to Patreon. If you enjoyed today's story and want to help us survive, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon, where you will find exclusive, true revenge stories that are even longer, featuring incredibly detailed situations and multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us dive right into today's tale of silent destruction as we follow my journey, and my name is Elena Vance. The 80th floor of the Sterling Omnicorp Tower in San Francisco was an architectural monument to modern corporate intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass wrapped around the boardroom, offering a dizzying, godlike view of the fog rolling silently over the Golden Gate Bridge. Inside the room, the air was perfectly climate-controlled, carrying the faint scent of polished mahogany, expensive leather, and freshly brewed artisanal espresso. This was the fortress of Silicon Valley's elite, a place where multi-million-dollar futures were decided with a casual nod. Today was supposed to be the final sign-off for the Smart City Initiative, a highly publicized, deeply ambitious project heavily funded by a combination of federal grants and top-tier private equity. The project promised autonomous transit grids, zero-emission infrastructure, and artificial intelligence-driven urban management. It was the crown jewel of their corporate portfolio, designed to cement their dominance for the next decade. I sat quietly near the far corner of the massive conference table. At 36 years old, dressed in a sharp, unbranded charcoal blazer, I blended seamlessly into the background of high-powered executives. I was not there to speak or to pitch ideas. I was the technical authorized representative for the Vanguard Nexus Consortium. My organization was the quiet giant standing in the shadows, holding the cryptographic keys to the project's lifeblood. Vanguard Nexus did not operate like a traditional bank. We were the custodians of smart contract liquidity, utilizing immutable blockchain protocols. To be exact, I was the sole physical authority required to greenlight the release of $2.9 billion. The heavy oak doors at the end of the room swung open. In walked Julian Sterling, the 32-year-old heir to the Sterling Empire. His mother, Chief Executive Officer Victoria Sterling, had just appointed him as the project director the day before. Julian wore a bespoke dark navy suit that practically screamed old money, but his posture reeked of new insecurity. He walked with a puffed-out chest and a predatory swagger, utterly desperate to prove to the assembled board of veteran directors that he was a formidable leader and not just the fortunate son of the founder who spent his 20s partying on private yachts. He needed to establish dominance early, to show these seasoned corporate sharks that he owned the room. Julian began circling the table, offering firm, aggressive handshakes and loud greetings to the senior vice presidents and chief officers. He slapped shoulders, laughed entirely too loudly, and projected an overwhelming aura of artificial confidence. The board members smiled back, indulging the young prince. Eventually, his path brought him to my corner of the table. As basic professional courtesy and standard business decorum dictated, I stood up from my leather chair. I extended my right hand toward him, maintaining a polite, neutral expression and direct eye contact. Julian stopped. He looked down at my outstretched hand for a long, agonizing second. Then, his eyes flicked upward, landing on the simple, standard-issue visitor badge clipped to my lapel, which listed my name and a heavily abbreviated version of my department. A slow, deeply mocking smirk crawled across his face. He scoffed, a short breath of pure disdain, and deliberately pulled his hand back, sliding it casually into his trouser pocket. Instead of addressing me, Julian pivoted his body toward the center of the room to ensure every single executive had a clear view of his performance. "We do not need technical audit clerks wasting time at the strategy table," Julian announced. His voice was loud, crisp, and dripping with condescension. "Let us keep this circle tight and focused on visionary leadership, shall we?" The boardroom plunged into a heavy, suffocating silence. A few of the older executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others suddenly found their digital tablets incredibly fascinating, refusing to make eye contact with me, in their world. A public humiliation like this was a test of character. They fully expected me to flush bright red, to stammer a pathetic apology, or perhaps to angrily assert my credentials and demand a seat at the table. They expected a noisy, emotional reaction that would only validate Julian's decision to cast me out. They did not understand that true power does not need to explain itself. I felt absolutely no anger, no embarrassment. Instead, a profound, icy calm settled in my chest. I looked at Julian, seeing right through his expensive suit to the terrified, arrogant little boy hiding underneath. I slowly lowered my hand. I gave him a faint, polite smile, the exact kind of smile you give a child who has just made a terribly foolish mistake. Without uttering a single syllable in my own defense, I calmly closed my laptop. I slipped the machine into my leather tote bag, pushed my chair neatly back under the table, and walked toward the heavy oak doors. My heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor, echoing the countdown to his absolute ruin. I walked out of the room, leaving Julian standing there, grinning triumphantly, completely oblivious to the fact that his cheap theatrical display of power had just sealed his own fate. People still harbor a wonderfully antiquated illusion about how massive fortunes move across the globe. They picture giant steel vaults, complicated wire transfers, or an anxious accountant simply clicking a button to send funds from one traditional bank to another. But when you are dealing with $2.9 billion of hybridized federal and private equity, the money does not just sit idly in a holding account waiting to be withdrawn by a wealthy executive. It exists as a highly volatile, strictly governed stream of encrypted capital, locked securely within a bespoke smart contract framework powered by a multi-signature blockchain protocol. It is a living digital entity, bound by ruthless mathematical logic rather than human discretion or corporate hierarchies. The architecture of this specific financial smart contract was designed to be completely unforgiving. The Vanguard Nexus Consortium did not trust corporate promises, and we certainly did not trust the fragile egos of legacy executives. We trusted cryptographic proofs. The core rule embedded deep within the root code dictated that the anchor capital could only be activated upon the direct, dual-authenticated confirmation of the technical authorized representative. That meant me. The protocol required both my legal cryptographic signature and a localized biometric verification precisely at the moment the project governance structure was finalized and approved. The system was entirely black and white, by explicitly denying me a seat at that strategy table and dismissing me from the boardroom before the governance structure was formally ratified. Julian had not merely insulted me, he had unwittingly committed a catastrophic structural error. In the cold, unblinking eyes of the immutable ledger, the forceful removal of the authorized technical custodian from the decision-making process was immediately categorized as a critical security failure. To the code, it was a blatant breach of fiduciary protocol. The elevator ride down to the subterranean parking levels of the Sterling Omnicorp building was incredibly peaceful. The ambient classical music piped through the hidden ceiling speakers felt like a fitting, elegant soundtrack for the quiet digital execution I was about to perform. The air in the underground garage was cool, heavy, and smelled faintly of ozone and expensive tire rubber, providing a stark, grounding contrast to the stifling arrogance I had just left behind. I walked at a measured, unhurried pace toward my heavy black sport utility vehicle, parked in a dimly lit reserved spot. Once secured inside the soundproofed cabin of my car, I did not reach for my smartphone. I did not draft a furious, emotionally charged email to human resources demanding an apology. I did not call my superiors to complain about the blatant disrespect I had just endured from a pampered heir. In the high-stakes world of algorithmic finance, emotional outbursts are a profound waste of energy. True control requires absolute silence. Instead, I reached into a hidden, steel-reinforced compartment beneath the center console and extracted my secondary device. It was a heavily modified, military-grade terminal that bypassed standard cellular networks entirely, connecting directly to a dedicated satellite uplink. I powered on the machine. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale, icy blue glow across my face in the shadows of the parking garage. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner embedded in the chassis and leaned forward for the retinal flash. Access granted. I navigated swiftly past 3 layers of encrypted firewalls, dropping directly into the Vanguard Nexus master control dashboard. The interface was stark and minimalist. In the center of the screen, the Smart City project node was currently pulsing with a soft green status indicator, patiently waiting to inject life-changing capital into the Sterling Empire. I opened the root command prompt. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a fraction of a second. It was not out of hesitation, but simply to savor the immense, crushing weight of the silence in that car. Then, I typed a single, decisive string of text into the system. Confirm governance structure rejected. I hit the Enter key. The response from the decentralized network was instantaneous and utterly merciless. On my screen, the vibrant green status bar abruptly snapped to a harsh, flashing crimson. The blockchain ledger updated across thousands of independent nodes across the globe in less than a second. The status of the $2.9 billion shifted instantaneously from pending release to a permanent state of indefinitely frozen and pending clawback. Every single cryptographic pathway connecting Vanguard Nexus to the corporate accounts of Sterling Omnicorp was severed, cauterized by lines of unbreakable code. The funds were not just delayed, they were conceptually annihilated from Julian's grasp, locked away behind a mathematical wall that no amount of corporate bullying could ever breach. I quietly shut the terminal down, sliding it back into the hidden compartment until it clicked securely into place. I started the engine of my car, the low, steady hum vibrating pleasantly through the leather steering wheel. As I pulled out of the concrete parking structure and merged onto the bustling, neon-lit streets of San Francisco, the world continued turning exactly as it had before. The iconic streetlights flickered on against the twilight as the evening fog rolled thicker over the bay, cloaking the city in mist. Up above, lost in the clouds on the top floor of that shimmering glass tower, Julian was undoubtedly popping expensive bottles of vintage champagne. I was likely toasting to his brilliant new leadership, celebrating his successful intimidation tactic, and basking in the applause of his sycophantic board members. He was standing at the absolute pinnacle of his world, completely unaware that the digital guillotine had already dropped, and the financial lifeblood of his entire billion-dollar legacy had just bled out quietly onto the floor. At exactly 8 o'clock the following morning, the high-speed financial terminals on the 65th floor of the Sterling Omnicorp Tower did not display their usual comforting glow of green digits. Instead, they violently flashed a blinding radioactive red. The chief accountant, a meticulous man who had served the company for 20 years, sat frozen at his desk, his morning espresso turning cold. He rubbed his eyes, convinced it was a visual glitch, and refreshed the master ledger for the 4th consecutive time. The result remained identically terrifying. The designated holding account for the Smart City initiative, which was supposed to be overflowing with $2.9 billion of hybridized capital, was completely empty. It showed a balance of exactly $0.00. The cryptographic bridge connecting their corporate accounts to the Vanguard Nexus liquidity pool had not merely failed, it had evaporated. Across town, inside a sprawling, glass-walled penthouse overlooking the bay, Julian was abruptly pulled from his champagne-induced slumber by the frantic, unending vibration of his personal smartphone. It was 8:15 in the morning. The caller identification displayed the name of the lead underwriter from their primary investment bank. Before Julian could even clear the sleep from his throat or answer the line, a second call chimed in from the head of the general contracting firm, followed immediately by a third from the city zoning commissioner. Julian sat up in his king-sized bed, a sudden, cold sweat breaking out across his forehead, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. The urgent text messages flooding his screen were a chaotic, overlapping blur of absolute panic, all demanding an answer to the exact same question: where was the anchor capital? Without that foundational funding secured and publicly verified on the blockchain ledger, the global financial markets reacted with the ruthless, mechanical efficiency of a starved predator catching the scent of blood. When the stock exchange bell rang at 9:30 in the morning, shares of the parent company immediately went into a terrifying freefall. In the first 10 minutes of open trading, the stock price plummeted 12%. By 9:45, it had crashed past 18%, triggering automatic circuit breakers on the trading floor and halting all buying and selling for the enterprise. The major financial news networks began broadcasting emergency alerts across the country, running breaking news tickers about a sudden, unexplained liquidity crisis at Silicon Valley's most prominent technology firm. Inside his penthouse, the smug, arrogant prince who had confidently strutted around the boardroom 12 hours earlier was entirely gone. I was replaced by a terrified, hyperventilating man staring directly into the abyss of his own ruin. Julian knew exactly what this catastrophic failure meant. If he picked up the phone, called his mother, and admitted that a multi-billion-dollar fund had mysteriously vanished under his watch on his very first day as project director, his executive career would be instantly and permanently terminated. His massive ego simply could not fathom the humiliation of crawling to Victoria Sterling to beg for salvation. So, driven by sheer, blinding panic and a toxic overdose of hubris, he chose the path of ultimate destruction. He decided he could cover it up, operating on a deeply flawed, outdated assumption that all digital walls could eventually be breached if enough illicit money was thrown at them. Julian contacted a black market broker he had met during his wilder, reckless yachting days. Within 20 minutes, he had wired a non-refundable retainer of $5 million from his personal offshore trust to a notorious syndicate of shadow hackers operating out of Eastern Europe. Their singular, desperate directive was incredibly clear. They were ordered to bypass the Vanguard Nexus security protocols, locate the frozen smart contract, shatter the cryptographic lock, and forcibly drag the $2.9 billion back into the Sterling Omnicorp accounts before the board of directors could convene an emergency crisis session at noon. While Julian's privileged world was actively burning to the ground, I was sitting comfortably at a small, sunlit corner table inside a quiet artisanal cafe just 3 blocks down the street from his corporate headquarters. The air inside the shop smelled wonderfully of roasted espresso beans and warm, buttery pastries. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, enjoying the bitter, earthy taste. Resting quietly against my ceramic mug was my heavily encrypted monitoring tablet, entirely unbothered by the chaos unfolding around the city. Through the secure, administrative dashboard, I watched Julian's hired mercenaries launch their digital assault. It was highly coordinated and undeniably aggressive, utilizing an impressive arsenal of brute force algorithms, zero-day vulnerability exploits, and rapid-fire data packet injections. The red warning indicators blinked frantically on my screen as the hackers slammed repeatedly into the outer perimeter of the Vanguard network. But to me, watching this desperate display was nothing more than a mild morning entertainment. The blockchain architecture I had locked into place the night before was built on a decentralized, quantum-resistant framework. I watched their incredibly expensive, high-stakes cyber attacks flare up on my monitor like tiny, insignificant sparks desperately trying to melt an immensely thick wall of solid titanium. They were throwing pebbles at a heavily fortified digital fortress, utterly oblivious to the devastating landmines buried right beneath their feet. Julian's fundamental misunderstanding of the sophisticated capital he was playing with proved to be his ultimate, inescapable undoing. This was not a standard corporate server or a vulnerable commercial bank. The Vanguard Nexus portfolio was deeply intertwined with classified federal infrastructure grants. By attempting an unauthorized, hostile breach of the smart contract, Julian's hackers did not just fail to retrieve the frozen money, they unknowingly tripped a highly classified digital tripwire buried deep within the core architecture of the fund. The federal failsafe was a draconian, automated response protocol designed specifically to protect government-backed assets from international cyberterrorism and rogue nation-states. When the defense system registered the sustained, hostile intrusion, it immediately traced the digital signature back to its origin. The attack was originating directly from a high-clearance subnetwork authorized by Julian himself. The system did not alert the Corporate Information Technology Department at Sterling Omnicorp. It bypassed the commercial sector entirely, prioritizing national security. At exactly 10:15 in the morning, the heavy, suffocating silence inside the chief executive's suite on the top floor of the Sterling Tower was shattered by the harsh ringing of a secure, unlisted telephone line. Victoria Sterling, the formidable matriarch and reigning chief executive officer, picked up the receiver, her face already pale and drawn from watching her company's stock value evaporate on the television screen. The voice on the other end of the line was neither a panicked investment banker nor an angry shareholder demanding answers. Victoria Sterling, the stern, authoritative voice stated without a single ounce of warmth. This is Special Agent Harris with the Cybercrimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are currently tracking an aggressive, Tier 1 cyber attack targeting a Federal Reserve node, and the hostile digital footprint is originating directly from your son's authorized administrative network. In that singular, devastating moment, the situation irrevocably breached the relatively safe boundaries of corporate negligence and plunged violently into the terrifying realm of federal felonies. The illusion of control that the Sterling family had wielded for decades was entirely shattered. The crisis had escalated far beyond a missing project budget or a plummeted stock price, completely escaping the pathetic, desperate grasp of Julian's frantic little hands. The atmosphere inside the executive boardroom on the 80th floor had violently transformed from a theater of boundless corporate triumph into a suffocating execution chamber. The celebratory aura of the previous evening was entirely eradicated, replaced by a dense, toxic cloud of primal fear and expensive cologne. At the far end of the room, a massive digital display that usually showcased glowing projections of future revenue was now broadcasting the live, merciless bloodbath of the open market. The red downward arrows, charting the catastrophic drop of the enterprise stock, seemed to bleed directly onto the polished mahogany table. The veteran board members, who had chuckled at my expense just 24 hours earlier, now sat frozen in their oversized leather chairs, their faces pale, their silent smartphones vibrating endlessly with panicked messages from institutional shareholders. Sitting at the absolute head of the table was Victoria Sterling. She did not look like a grieving mother trying to comfort a stressed child. She looked like an apex predator meticulously evaluating a severely wounded, bleeding animal. Her posture was rigidly straight, her expression carved from solid granite. She had built this global monopoly from a single rented office over 30 years of ruthless maneuvering, and she possessed a supernatural, infallible radar for deception. Julian stood at the opposite end of the long table, actively unraveling before their eyes. The bespoke dark navy suit that had projected such terrifying authority yesterday now hung awkwardly on his frame, looking like a cheap costume on a shrinking man. His silk tie was loosened and crooked. The arrogant, predatory smirk had vanished entirely, replaced by the frantic, wide-eyed stare of a cornered rat trapped in a burning cage. "It is a glitch," Julian stammered, his voice cracking noticeably as he addressed his mother and the terrified board of directors. He pressed his trembling palms flat against the table, trying desperately to anchor himself. A catastrophic system failure on the partner's end. Vanguard Nexus, must have experienced a critical server collapse overnight. It is a technical error. Nothing more. We are looking into it right now. We have our best engineers on the line. We are handling it completely." Victoria did not blink. She did not nod. She simply stared at her son, surgically dissecting his trembling hands, the heavy bead of sweat racing down his temple, and the desperate, hollow, overly rehearsed pitch of his voice. She knew, with the absolute certainty of a seasoned billionaire, that he was lying to her face. "Stop talking, Julian," Victoria commanded. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the heavy air of the boardroom like a perfectly sharpened steel blade. She turned her icy gaze away from him and looked directly at her chief operating officer. "Locate the technical authorized representative from Vanguard Nexus. Find her immediately. I do not care what it takes. I want her inside this room before the hour is over." I did not make them wait. I was already sitting comfortably in the expansive marble lobby on the ground floor, sipping the last warm drops of my black coffee, quietly anticipating the inevitable summon. When the private elevator doors slid open on the 80th floor, the frantic executive assistants parted rapidly, stepping aside like the Red Sea. I walked through the heavy oak doors and stepped into the exact same boardroom I had been banished from the day before. I wore the identical unbranded charcoal blazer. My posture was exactly the same. My expression was perfectly neutral. Yet, the entire gravitational pull of the room had inverted completely. The veteran directors who had cowardly studied their digital tablets yesterday now stared at me with wide, desperate, pleading eyes. I was no longer the invisible, expendable audit clerk wasting their strategic time. I was the absolute executioner, holding the heavy axe hovering directly over their collective corporate necks. The moment I took my seat near the center of the table, Julian snapped. Driven by the blinding adrenaline of sheer panic, he launched into a desperate, theatrical offensive, attempting to reclaim a shattered illusion of power in front of his formidable mother. He slammed both of his fists onto the mahogany surface, leaning aggressively across the table. "You did this," Julian shouted, pointing a visibly shaking finger directly at my face. He was panting, his chest heaving with manic energy. "This is a deliberate, malicious act of corporate sabotage. You purposefully locked us out of our own capital. You are illegally holding the Smart City Initiative hostage because of some petty, pathetic personal grievance from yesterday. I will have our legal department bury you and your consortium in federal injunctions by noon today. We will sue you for tortious interference, gross negligence, and a fundamental breach of fiduciary duty. I will personally ensure you never work in this valley again." I let his furious words echo off the reinforced glass walls, bouncing harmlessly into the quiet room. I did not frown in anger. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not match his hysterical, desperate energy. Emotional responses are the currency of those who have lost control, and I had no interest in spending a single cent. I simply reached into my leather tote bag, withdrew a single, slender manila folder, and slid it gently across the polished wooden surface. It glided smoothly, stopping exactly in the center of the table, resting there like a primed, ticking explosive device. "I highly recommend that you consult with elite criminal defense attorneys before you start drafting those civil lawsuits. Julian," I said. My voice was incredibly smooth, quiet, and utterly devoid of any human sympathy. Victoria Sterling moved with predatory speed, snatching the folder before anyone else could even reach for it. She flipped it open. Her sharp eyes darted rapidly across the printed pages, absorbing the brutal, undeniable truth laid out in stark black and white ink. "That folder contains the immutable network logs from the past 4 hours, I explained, ensuring my voice carried clearly to every terrified executive in the room. It details a highly coordinated, brute force cyber penetration attempt directed against a Federal Reserve node managed by Vanguard Nexus. The digital footprint for the attack bypasses all external servers and traces directly back to a high-clearance administrative terminal inside this very building, specifically, your son's authorized terminal." I paused for a fraction of a second, watching the color drain completely from Victoria's face as she read the final page. Furthermore, I continued, the documents highlight an expedited offshore wire transfer of exactly $5 million, sent at 8:30 this morning, to a known black market syndicate operating in Eastern Europe. You did not just experience a system glitch. Julian, you panicked, and in your absolute panic, you hired digital mercenaries to forcefully extract locked capital. The silence that instantly swallowed the boardroom was absolute and terrifying. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet that occurs right after a fatal car crash, in those agonizing seconds before the emergency sirens begin to wail. Every seasoned executive in the room instantly calculated the devastating legal ramifications of my words. A breach of a corporate contract was merely a civil matter, a headache usually resolved with a hefty financial fine and a quiet, non-disclosure settlement. But launching a targeted, financed cyber attack against a financial fund holding protected federal assets was a severe, inescapable criminal offense. It was a direct, arrogant violation of national security protocols. It did not mean a slap on the wrist. It meant federal prison time. Julian's legs seemed to lose all structural integrity. He collapsed backward, falling heavily into his oversized chair. All the remaining blood drained rapidly from his face, leaving his skin the sickly color of wet ash. The horrifying realization of his spectacular, undeniable downfall crashed over him, completely suffocating his monumental arrogance beneath an ocean of legal terror. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at me, his eyes wide and vacant, silently begging for a lifeline that absolutely did not exist. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms gracefully on the edge of the cold mahogany table. I locked my gaze squarely with his terrified, hollow eyes, and I offered him the exact same polite, faint smile I had given him the day before. Did you honestly believe I refused to shake your hand yesterday because my ego was bruised? I asked softly, my words falling like heavy stones into the dead, frozen quiet of the room. No, Julian, I did not shake your hand because I knew immediately, the very second you made that arrogant choice, that you were going to eagerly dig your own grave. I simply decided to step back in silence and hand you the shovel. The true beauty of modern corporate warfare is that the most devastating traps are completely invisible. They are not hidden in shadows. They are printed in plain sight, buried beneath hundreds of pages of tedious legal jargon that arrogant men never bother to read. What Julian Sterling failed to comprehend was that my quiet exit from the boardroom yesterday was merely the activation phase of a much larger, far more intricate mechanism. Freezing the capital was never my ultimate goal. It was simply the bait. I had constructed a highly specialized digital honeypot, a psychological snare tailored specifically for a man with a fragile ego and inherited power. I calculated that someone as deeply insecure and spectacularly entitled as Julian would never humbly admit his failure to his formidable mother. When cornered by his own incompetence, a man accustomed to buying his way out of consequences would inevitably resort to brute force. The frozen funds were the cheese, and his hired Eastern European mercenaries were the desperate, predictable lunge that snapped the trap shut. I reached back into my leather tote bag and withdrew a second, much thicker document. It was a certified copy of the Master Partnership Agreement, the foundational contract that had birthed the Smart City Initiative. The document was hundreds of pages long, filled with microscopic print and dense regulatory clauses. I dropped it onto the table. The heavy thud echoed loudly over the terrified whispers of the board members. I am sure your incredibly expensive corporate attorneys charged you thousands of dollars an hour to review this agreement, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the mounting panic. But I highly doubt any of them paid close attention to Section 7. Subsection B. Paragraph 4. It is a very specific, deeply buried provision regarding federal infrastructure integrity. We refer to it internally as the forfeiture clause. Every single eye in the room locked onto the thick binder. Nobody dared to reach for it. The clause explicitly states that in the event of a catastrophic security breach, specifically a hostile cyber intrusion orchestrated or facilitated by the managing partner, Vanguard Nexus is legally obligated to protect the federal assets at all costs, I explained, enunciating every word with crisp, deliberate precision, because the digital footprint of this morning's attack originated from an authorized executive terminal within this building. Sterling Omnicorp has fundamentally violated the core security mandate of the partnership. I let that terrifying reality sink into their bones for a moment before delivering the final, fatal blow. Vanguard Nexus is not merely keeping the $2.9 billion frozen, I declared, my tone utterly devoid of malice, presenting the apocalypse as a simple matter of administrative procedure. Under the strict parameters of the forfeiture clause, your unprovoked cyber attack has triggered an automatic, non-negotiable buyout provision, effective immediately. Vanguard Nexus is exercising its legal right to acquire the entire Smart City subsidiary, including all proprietary algorithms, infrastructure patents, and autonomous transit grids, for the symbolic purchase price of exactly $1. We are doing this to ensure the absolute integrity of the project. The room imploded. The realization crashed into Julian like a runaway freight train. He had not merely lost a massive federal grant. He had not simply caused a temporary dip in the stock market because he wanted to flex his pathetic, artificial authority for 5 seconds in a boardroom. He had quite literally gift-wrapped his family's crowning achievement, a multi-billion-dollar technological empire, and handed it directly to a rival organization for the price of a cheap cup of coffee. The profound, suffocating gravity of his monumental stupidity finally shattered his mind. He gripped the edges of the mahogany table, gasping for air, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for a savior. But there was no salvation to be found. The legendary loyalty of the Sterling Board of Directors vanished in an instant. The seasoned executives, sensing the immense legal and financial liability about to rain down upon them, turned into a pack of starving wolves. They erupted into a cacophony of shouting, viciously turning on Julian. The chief operating officer slammed his fist against the table, demanding Julian's immediate resignation. The head of legal yelled about criminal liability, desperately trying to distance the broader enterprise from Julian's rogue actions. They bared their teeth, viciously tearing apart the young prince they had happily indulged just yesterday, desperately trying to feed him to the federal authorities to save their own lucrative careers. Through all the screaming and the chaotic, venomous finger-pointing, Victoria Sterling remained entirely silent. She did not yell at the board members to calm down. She did not rush to defend her son. She simply sat at the head of the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked at Julian, and the expression on her face was far more devastating than any screaming match. It was the absolute, icy void of a matriarch looking at a failed heir. It was pure, unadulterated disappointment. She looked at him as if he were already a ghost. I remained perfectly still in my chair, sipping the chaos like a fine vintage wine. I did not need to raise my voice or pound my fists on the table. I simply sat there, completely enveloped in the quiet, absolute power of my position, flawlessly controlling the brutal rhythm of their total collapse. Staring into the looming threat of massive federal indictments and the total financial liquidation of her life's work, Victoria Sterling did exactly what any apex corporate predator would do to survive. She amputated the infected limb to save the core body. The emergency board vote took less than 5 minutes to finalize. It was entirely unanimous. Julian was terminated on the spot, completely stripped of his executive title, escorted out of the building by armed security, and legally severed from the family trust fund. The Smart City subsidiary, the crown jewel of their portfolio, was formally surrendered to Vanguard Nexus to satisfy the contractual breach. The following afternoon, I sat in my pristine, minimalist office at the Vanguard headquarters. The heavy glass door opened, and Julian walked in. He was entirely unaccompanied. There was no sycophantic entourage, no bespoke dark navy suit, and absolutely no predatory swagger. He wore a simple, wrinkled gray sweater, looking 10 years older and completely hollowed out. He carried a heavy cardboard box containing the original master blueprints and the physical transfer deeds. He placed the box gently onto my desk. Julian did not look at me at first. He stared at the carpet, his hands trembling violently by his sides. "I am so sorry," Julian whispered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of any former arrogance. "I am completely ruined. My mother has cut me off entirely. I have absolutely nothing left. Please, I am begging you. Do not hand the server logs over to the Federal Bureau. If they indict me, I will not survive federal prison." I let him stand there in the crushing silence for a very long time, allowing the agonizing weight of his reality to fully settle in the room. Then, I slowly stood up from my chair. I walked around the edge of my desk until I was standing directly in front of him. This time, I did not turn my back. I did not gather my things and walk away. I slowly extended my right hand. It was not a gesture of forgiveness. It was the ultimate, inescapable ritual of conquest, forcing a thoroughly broken man to physically acknowledge his absolute submission. Julian looked down at my hand. A single tear rolled down his pale, sunken cheek. He slowly raised his own shaking arm and grasped my fingers. His skin was freezing cold and damp with nervous sweat. It was a pathetic, lifeless handshake, but it officially ended the career of the Silicon Valley tech prince. With his signature secured on the final deed of transfer, I tapped a single execution key on my terminal. A soft, pleasant chime echoed through the office. The system refreshed instantly. The $2.9 billion immediately shifted from frozen to active, surging smoothly into the Vanguard Nexus operating accounts. The massive project was back online, perfectly healthy, but it now belonged entirely to us. People fundamentally misunderstand how the modern world actually works. Power is not something you inherit through a wealthy bloodline, and it is certainly not something you seize by being loud and obnoxious in a boardroom. Power is knowing exactly which part of the bridge you hold, and simply pulling out one single brick in absolute silence, watching their entire empire collapse into dust at your feet. Thank you so very much for listening to my story today. Where in the world are you tuning in from right now? Please let me know down in the comments, as I love reading where our audience is located. As a quick reminder, if you found today's story captivating, our channel will unfortunately not be uploading any new videos in the near future due to our current monetization situation. We are shifting our operations entirely to Patreon to keep the project alive. Please help us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon community. There, you can listen to our absolute best, exclusive, true revenge tales that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can easily join right now by scanning the QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Thank you again for your incredible support, and take care.